Would you give us an example of a successful effort to craft a message in a difficult circumstance?
So I think an example of a successful attempt to craft a message in harder circumstances or under pressure. I'll give you two examples from Liberia, where I spent some years working on communications issues. The first example was when President Sirleaf decided to dismiss her entire cabinet summarily, which was definitely took a lot of not only the public, well, everybody in the public, but a lot of people in government by surprise as well. And it was a very sort of bold move to sort of refresh the talent and the sort of momentum of government. What was so dramatic about it is, without warning, and it was a very sort of closely guarded decision. In a post-conflict, fragile situation like Liberia, a country which has had 14 years of civil war, which has had, cabinets being executed on the beach during a coup, a very, vulnerable and easily kind of spooked population. An announcement like that can be really actually quite serious and quite destabilizing. I mean, it can trigger a serious crisis because people can start to, as the word gets out through very imperfect, media channels and channels of communication into rural areas, the way it can be interpreted, that kind of game of telephone that happens, people can think that there's a coup happening or a new civil war. And actually, you can create a refugee problem out of nowhere. It's that serious. And so I think, even though there are many positive dimensions, there was a real challenge for the communications team in that government to think about how to deal with this. And so, as I've already spoken about, what was really important, most of all, was that first half hour to an hour of what to do, how to manage this. I think the team recognized the seriousness of this development and how it could be perceived. Very quickly moved to work with the president to put out a clear statement on as many channels as possible that evening. So to kind of break the news cycle and do a special national radio broadcast to allay concerns and to explain what was happening and why this was being done. It was really just to refresh and renew the kind of talent in that, in the cabinet, and then reconstitute it quickly. And so the first really important thing was to explain to the principal involved, well, this is how this could be perceived, and that that's the communication staff doing their job and saying we need to get a message out there, which is, don't panic. This is just an administrative, prerogative of the president to kind of take this decision. It's not a coup. It's not a kind of upending of stability and democracy. It's just her exercising her right to kind of reconstitute that group, and then getting that out in an immediate radio broadcast across all the radio channels, getting ahead of that story before, instead of waiting till the next morning, because this happened in the evening, instead of waiting till the next morning, by which time all sorts of ideas and interpretations could be at large. And then from there, that enough is not on its own. Then from there, having to actually sit down and think about, well, what are all the questions that people are going to ask about this? Everything from when are you going to reconstitute the cabinet and is government going to continue, to do they still get to use their ministerial cars while they're on administrative leave? These are the sorts of things in a resource-scarce environment that people ask. It became one of the hottest topics, is like the use of ministerial cars. And it became a game where people would try and take photographs of ministers who'd been fired still using the ministerial car. And the communications team has got to be ready to deal with that and to say, well, what's our policy about that? Again, not just what you say, but what you do. What decision are we actually making about this? So anticipating the sort of communications, how the story will evolve and how the kind of, how it will cascade, enables you to anticipate and make sensible decisions about what your policy position is, and also to resolve the situation quickly. To understand how destabilizing it can be brings home the need to set a clear deadline, a timeline for when the cabinet will be reconstituted. A great example of communications considerations needing to integrate with and drive the decisions about what you actually do. The other example I'd give is outside of central government, which was the discovery of oil in Liberia. In a very, very poor country which is natural resource dependent, but that's mining resources. The discovery of oil is potentially like winning the lottery. And I think pretty much everybody around the world, in general, there's a low understanding of the contents of the oil industry from anywhere in the world, but people know that oil is basically the world's most valuable commodity. And so if we strike oil, there's going to be a lot of money involved. But the expectations, the sort of explosion of expectations, what I used to sort of half-jokingly call, for those people who remember the World Cup in South Africa and those horns, those vuvuzela horns that people would blow during the games, there's this kind of constant blaring noise. I used to refer to it as oil vuvuzela. There was every day there was just this clamour and this huge sort of expectation of like, well, we're rich, where's our money, where's my job on the rig, and so on. Very challenging circumstance, very, very quick response needed from the government and from the national oil regulator to try and manage those expectations, formulate the message, what are the values and the principles that are going to guide the way we move forward with our oil sector. And they chose transparency, inclusiveness, sustainability, environmental protection, being clear, what are our messages, what are our values. The most important message of all, first of all, we don't know if this oil is commercially viable. Second of all, even if it's commercially viable, it's going to take 10 to 15 years to develop this to production. And just trying to drive that message home, even 2 years later, there's still a large proportion of the public who haven't been able to absorb those two messages. And so it's very, very difficult to swim against the stream of expectations. And I think the government did it as well as can possibly be expected, but it illustrates how hard it is to try and get a message across when people just want to run with a story.
Are there any examples you can offer of successful communication where most people live in rural areas and have no access to television and very little access possibly to radio or to newspapers? How do you communicate with people in rural areas?
Well, I mean, a good principle of good communications is you have to match your channel to your audience. And so, in my experience, people in rural areas actually do use the radio and rely on it or not. But there are, of course, many situations where they don't. The radio is a very powerful medium, but often national radios don't reach into rural areas. But there are local stations, and so if there are local stations, I think it's very, very powerful to go and work with work with those local stations who are trusted and have the reach into that local area. And if you're dealing with language differences, that's also extremely important. In lots of countries where there are, sub-regional languages or kind of local dialects, it's essential to match not just the channel but the content, to your particular audience. If radio isn't there, then I think your only choice is to go and engage with people directly. And governments, I think, are getting a bit better at the methodology of sort of town halls, talking sessions. Whether it's a kind of Kachacha model, or if it's a kind of Palava hut model, or if it's just a town hall, going there, working with local leaders and local stakeholders and sort of local organisers to kind of organise, get people into a room, and then engage them and not only talk to them but listen to them as well. I think is really important. There's often just no substitute to driving 2 days along a really, really bad road and actually going somewhere in person. There's no real way around it. Of course, there are ways to kind of like send written materials, but it's not very effective, especially if you're talking about very remote rural areas with low levels of education. So find the most the best adapted channel, but also think about the content of what you're going to say, and also using word of mouth and local means and and kind of local mediators, but also using sometimes items, T-shirts or pictorial forms of communication, to explain. Health agencies are very, very good at using simple instructions to explain. An A4 laminated sheet that says this is how you take these pills at night time, these pills in the daytime. You can do something as simple as that to explain what's happening with the mine which is being built in this rural area on top of a huge iron ore deposit. This is what's in a sort of 7 panels of pictorial form, explain what's happening, but also use T-shirts, merchant, sort of motorcycle helmets that say that promote road safety. There's ways of getting your messages out. Take inspiration from advertising and from marketing sometimes to think about the channels you can use to get a message out.
In a country where many journalists are new to their jobs and where the press may be highly politicized, perhaps it is highly politicized in most places, are there any special steps that a spokesperson could take to try to improve accuracy or build understanding and get the message out?
So I think that's a really difficult one, and I think there are lots of problems, certainly those that you identified, and other issues and tensions often with the media and the press in countries all over the world, in both developed and developing environments. I think one principle which is true everywhere is the importance of engaging the press directly and building relationships. So first of all, I think holding seminars or briefing sessions and building those links and relationships between government spokespeople, government communications people, and the press is really, really important, because you can try and mitigate some of the politicization or the sort of factionalism, also some of the sort of expectations or demands that the press can make by engaging and providing that time and attention. But that and that's true everywhere. Those relationships. It's not just about good press releases, it's about building good relationships. I think that the government can try and promote and partner with capacity building agencies and NGOs and institutions which are working to improve the quality of the press, because an effective press is so important for a country, whether that's donor agencies or local agencies who are running workshops. I think whatever the government can do to sort of support, promote, encourage that and partner, I think is really useful, and potentially can mitigate some of those challenges and try and tackle some of those capacity problems. And I think the third thing I would say is tailoring content to journalists. So you sort of try and make their life as easy as possible by thinking about how you package your information, package your announcements, your briefing materials at an event, trying to make it very clear, very straightforward, not to overcomplicate. So make it reduce the obstacles for journalists to be able to report on what government is doing and do it in an accurate way.
If a president or prime minister wants to help a country draft a long-term strategy, consultation with members of the public is often a really important element. Do you have any special advice for the people responsible for strategy development about how to make members of the public aware of the process and win their engagement?
So I think when a government or a president is trying to develop a sort of long-term development strategy, there are some things they can try to do, or some principles to think about, some guidelines which help make that consultation and listening process effective. I think first of all is you've got to give yourself a long lead time. You've got to build in time for this. Don't do it as a quick, rushed afterthought the month before this thing is due to be presented to your external multilateral partners, for example. Don't do it as a last-minute scramble. Give yourself a lead time, plan it, resource it properly, and that means both financially, but also a dedicated sort of task force of people whose responsibility it is to execute a national consultation. So you've got to give them the right support and the right resources. Make sure that not only is the consultation truly inclusive, but even sometimes the process of designing the consultation has to be inclusive, and take into account different points of view, so that whoever's in charge of designing and then executing this consultation, I think, needs to take advice and listen, because often assumptions can be built into the way it's designed, which completely forgets an important stakeholder group. Again, long lead time, advertise as widely as you can, tailor your materials, make them simple, really work to make your materials, your sort of explanatory materials very, very straightforward along the lines that I was speaking about before. And above all, I think above all, and this is true of consultations anywhere, don't waste people's time. If you go to a consultation but the decision's already been made, people aren't stupid, they know. So if they come, no matter how many free lunches or per diems or or whatever it is that you provide to come and participate in a consultation session, if people have the sense that it's all minds have already been made up, this document isn't going to change, this consultation is a sort of lip service to actually listening to people, you will generate far more anger and antipathy than if you'd never done it at all, most likely. So I think that's very, very important to bear in mind.
Finally, what kinds of personal aptitudes and experiences make someone an effective spokesperson?
I'd say the number one, it's a good question. The number one thing is I'd say is nerves under pressure. You've just got to have nerves of steel, because if you're standing in a press conference, especially responding to questions, one thing to read from a piece of paper, another thing to respond to questions on behalf of a president or a minister or a whole government or a country, and to not slip up and not say the wrong thing or create an enormous story just through some sort of misspeaking or mistake. You really need very, 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 very strong nerves. Of course, you need a good turn of phrase and to be able to communicate confidently and clearly. And I think an ability to simplify things, use short words, speak clearly is very important. An ability, I mentioned already that it's far more than about just good press releases or good speeches or good making statements or talking. It's the relationships, the ability to build rapport. You watch a very good press officer who's responding to a press conference. They know the people in the room. They know where that question is coming from. They know who they're going to ask next. They understand the sort of agenda that might be behind a particular newspaper or a particular journalist. But there's also a rapport, so there's trust and a relationship between the people in that room. And the ability to do that and be liked by a press corps, I think, is really, really important. I would also say that iron discipline about timing, about meeting deadlines, about responding to people, about having your messages clear and being prepared requires huge discipline. And finally, stamina, enormous amount of stamina, because it's long hours, a willingness to work hard and work long to kind of manage this never-ending flow of issues, crises, problems and challenges that every government has to face.